Welcome to Crimes in the Dark, the channel where the most chilling crimes come to life in the dark. Before sleep catches up with you, like, subscribe, and tell me where you're listening to this story from. Now, turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let yourself go, because what you are about to hear is real. Case 1. The night Becky Lester died, her body was found at the bottom of the back stairs of her house. She lay face up in a pool of blood, surrounded by evidence that didn't fit the version of an accidental fall. The lights were on, but the atmosphere was tense, as if something dark still hung in the air. Paramedics arrived after a frantic call from Ray Lester, her husband, but could do nothing for her. During the resuscitation attempt, they slipped on blood, leaving footprints all over the house and complicating the scene for investigators. The first observations immediately raised suspicions. On the walls near the stairs were blood spatter, some too high to be consistent with a simple fall. In the kitchen, a half-empty bottle of tequila and 2 shot glasses suggested that someone had been drinking that night. One of the glasses was intact, but the other had traces of liquid and a reddish stain on the rim. In the trash, a bloody paper towel indicated a hurried attempt to clean something up. Most disturbing was the discovery of bite marks on Becky's chest. They were not deep, but visible enough to suggest extreme violence. Her body was perfectly aligned, with her head and spine straight, unusual for an accidental fall. In addition, his hand showed no defensive fractures, indicating that he had not attempted to protect himself. To top it off, although there were bloody footprints all over the house, Becky's feet had no traces of blood on them, suggesting that someone else had been involved in moving her body or partially cleaning up the scene. The detective in charge of the case, Marcus Hale, arrived shortly thereafter. He was an experienced man, known for his meticulousness and his ability to spot details that others overlooked. Upon seeing the scene, he knew immediately that this was no accident. With a somber expression, he began to analyze every nook and cranny, aware that the key to solving this case was hidden among the contradictions of that night. Detective Marcus Hale furthered the investigation by meticulously reviewing Becky Lester's accounts and background. He discovered that Becky, 40, led a seemingly normal life as an employee at Western Airlines, where she had earned a solid reputation for professionalism and dedication. However, upon analyzing her family ties, the detective confirmed that Becky was the wife of Raymond Lester and the stepmother of Susan Lester, Raymond's daughter from a previous marriage. This detail was relevant because of the tensions evident within the family dynamic, especially considering that Becky had never achieved a close relationship with Susan. In addition, Becky's finances appeared stable but not exuberant, which contrasted with Raymond's difficult financial situation. These findings led the detective to wonder if some financial or emotional conflict within the household might have been a key factor in the events leading up to her death. Questioning: Raymond Lester. Interrogation: Raymond Lester. Raymond Lester entered the interrogation room with a tense face, his eyes darting between the documents on the table and Detective Marcus Hale, who watched him silently. The fluorescent light from the ceiling cast harsh shadows on his pale skin, highlighting the reddish marks on his neck. They were recent bites, fresh even, which contrasted with his attempt to appear calm. The detective said nothing at first, letting the weight of silence fill the room as he studied every gesture of the man in front of him. Raymond was a middle-aged man with slightly tousled brown hair and a wrinkled shirt that smelled of stale alcohol. His posture, though he tried to appear relaxed, betrayed a deep anxiety. His hands trembled slightly as he crossed his arms, as if to protect himself from something invisible but omnipresent. Marcus Hale knew there was something else behind that grieving widower facade, something he was about to expose. The detective began by reviewing Raymond's financial background. The numbers spoke for themselves. 5 rejected loan applications in the past few months, bank accounts on the verge of collapse, and a mortgage that threatened to devour what little was left of his estate. But most telling was the discovery of a life insurance policy in Becky Lester's name, worth $250,000. It wasn't the first time Raymond had collected on insurance after the death of a wife. His first wife, Jackie, had passed away years earlier under circumstances that were never entirely clear, and the insurance money had been enough to keep him afloat for a while. Now, with Becky dead, the pattern seemed to repeat itself. Was it a coincidence? Marcus Hale didn't believe in coincidences. When the detective confronted Raymond with these suspicions, the man shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He denied any involvement in Becky's death, claiming that he had been asleep by the pool after a leisurely dinner and a few glasses of tequila. According to his version, he awoke startled to hear a thud, ran to the back stairs and found Becky's body at the foot of the steps. But his alibi was flimsy, too convenient to be credible. Besides, the physical evidence contradicted his story. Becky's feet had no traces of blood on them, suggesting that someone else had moved her after her death. And then there were the bite marks. The bites on Becky's neck were identical to those that now decorated Raymond's neck. When the detective pointed this out, the man hesitated before admitting that both he and Becky shared a bite fetish. It was something intimate, something that had been part of their relationship in the past, although it had been 4 years since they had shared that kind of intimacy. They slept in separate rooms, emotionally distant, but apparently the fetish was still alive in Raymond, though not with Becky. The detective pressed harder, asking who had left those marks on his neck. Raymond hesitated. His breathing quickened and his eyes searched for a way out that didn't exist. Finally, he confessed that he had been seeing someone else. Dr. Lauren Cohen, his dentist. According to Raymond, Lauren shared his interest in bites, and that night before dinner, they had been in her office together. It was she who had left the marks on his neck, a detail that now made him vulnerable to suspicion. The connection between the bites on Becky and Raymond's preferences raised a disturbing question. Who had bitten Becky before her death? If Raymond claimed that he had not been with her that night, then someone else must have been involved. Could it have been Lauren Cohen? Dr. Cohen had access to personal information about Raymond and Becky, and her clandestine relationship with the victim's husband added a layer of complexity to the case. But there was still no direct evidence linking her to the crime. As the detective analyzed these possibilities, Raymond continued to sit across from him, sweating in the unrelenting light. His story had holes in it, his finances were a mess, and his alibi didn't stand up to close scrutiny. Yet something about his demeanor didn't quite add up. Although he seemed nervous, he didn't show the level of desperation one would expect from a trapped killer. Maybe he was guilty. Maybe he was just scared because of his infidelity and financial problems. Or maybe someone else had used his relationship with Lauren and his precarious situation to cover up a much more calculated crime. The interrogation ended without a clear confession, but left the detective with more questions than answers. The bites, the insurance money, the infidelity, and the contradictions at the crime scene formed a puzzle that was still far from being solved. And at the center of it all, the figure of Dr. Lauren Cohen was beginning to take shape as a key piece on this dark chessboard. New revelations, autopsy, and DNA. Becky Lester's autopsy revealed truths that completely transformed the investigation. She had not died from the fall, as initially speculated. The injuries to her head told a much more violent story. 5 skull fractures caused by repeated blows with a blunt object. Forensics determined that the impacts were severe enough to incapacitate her almost immediately, rendering her unconscious before her body was moved to the foot of the stairs. This definitively confirmed that her death was not accidental, but premeditated. But what really shook the investigators was the DNA analysis. On Becky's chest, the bite marks contained traces of saliva that made it possible to identify the perpetrator. The genetic profile matched someone close to the victim, someone who had been with her that night. Even more disturbing, the tests also detected recent sexual activity. Becky had not only been bitten, she had been intimate shortly before her murder. These details added a layer of cruelty to the crime, suggesting that the victim had fully trusted her assailant. Detective Marcus Hale reviewed every lead in this new light. The bites were no longer just an indication of shared fetishism between Becky and Raymond. They now pointed directly to a specific person. And although Dr. Jerry Cohen had been ruled out as a suspect after verifying her alibi and lack of physical ties to the crime scene, DNA analysis opened up new lines of investigation. The connection between the bites, the intimate relationship, and the fatal blows suggested that the killer not only knew Becky well, but had also exploited her trust to carry out the crime. Hale returned to Raymond Lester's file with renewed intensity. The marks on his neck, identical to those found on Becky's body, remained a key piece of the puzzle. However, the DNA obtained from the bites did not match Raymond. This ruled out the possibility that he had been the one who left those specific marks, although his infidelity with Dr. Cohen remained a potential point of conflict. If Becky had discovered her husband's clandestine relationship, it could have confronted both of them, triggering a volatile situation. But with no physical evidence linking Cohen to the crime, this line of investigation seemed to hit a dead end. DNA analysis also revealed something unexpected. The genetic profile found on the bites matched a woman, but it was neither Becky nor Dr. Cohen. This led the investigation team to broaden their search, focusing on other people close to the victim. Who else had access to Becky? Who could have been with her that night, sharing intimacy, and then brutally attacking her? Detective Hale knew he was close to solving the case, but crucial pieces were still missing to complete the puzzle. Adam Guilford, the lover, and the blackmailer. The DNA analysis that identified the person responsible for the bites on Becky Lester's body led the investigation team directly to Adam Guilford. Adam, Becky's boss at Western Airlines and her lover for more than a year, was an ambitious and calculating man. At 45, he had built a solid reputation within the company as someone who always got what he wanted, both in business and in his personal life. However, beneath that facade of professional success were secrets that were now beginning to emerge. Adam was not only Becky's superior, he also had privileged access to financial information about her and Raymond. He knew all about the $250,000 life insurance policy Ray had taken out in Becky's name, as well as the financial problems that were stifling the marriage. But what was most revealing was to discover that Adam and Becky had a much more complex relationship than it appeared at first glance. According to Adam, Becky was planning to divorce Raymond, but had not done so up to that point because she feared that a legal separation would complicate the division of assets. Instead of acting openly, Becky had decided to play her cards strategically. During the interrogation, Adam produced a letter written by Becky. It was a chilling document, full of incriminating details about the death of Jackie, Raymond's first wife. Becky had been investigating Jackie's alleged accidental death and believed she had enough evidence to suggest that Raymond had been involved in her demise. The letter was addressed to Raymond and contained a clear threat. If he tried anything against her, Becky would go public with all the information she had gathered, destroying his reputation and exposing him to the authorities. This discovery added a new layer of tension to the case. Had Becky been murdered to prevent him from carrying out his blackmail plan? However, Adam had his own reasons for wishing Becky dead. Although he claimed to be in love with her, their relationship was far from perfect. Becky had begun pressuring him to leave his wife and go public with their relationship, something Adam was unwilling to do. Furthermore, if Becky revealed their affair, it could jeopardize his position at Western Airlines, where they both worked. Such a scandal could ruin his career and his marriage, two things Adam valued deeply. These factors made him a plausible suspect, especially considering that he had no solid alibi for the night of the crime. Despite these suspicions, physical evidence failed to directly link Adam to the murder. Although his DNA matched the bites on Becky's body, this only confirmed that he had been with her prior to her death. There was no evidence that he had been present at the crime scene, or that he had struck Becky with the blunt object that caused her skull fractures. Furthermore, Adam vehemently denied any involvement in the murder, arguing that his relationship with Becky was precisely the reason he would never have wanted to hurt her. Detective Marcus Hale reviewed every detail of the case in this new light. Becky's letter suggested that Raymond had a powerful motive for silencing her, but the physical evidence did not place him directly at the scene of the crime. The second interrogation of Raymond Lester was different. This time, Detective Marcus Hale did not focus solely on finances or Raymond's relationship with Becky, but on the secrets they had both been keeping. The letter Adam Guilford had presented during his interrogation was a ticking time bomb, and Raymond could not deny its contents. He admitted, in a trembling voice, that Becky had been blackmailing him. She knew too much about the death of Jackie, his first wife, and she was determined to use that information to make sure he didn't try anything against her. According to Raymond, Becky had threatened to expose him publicly if he did not agree to a favorable financial settlement in the event of a divorce. But something about his statement didn't quite add up. Although Raymond insisted that he would never have hurt Becky, his body language revealed unease. His hands trembled as he held the letter, and his eyes avoided direct contact with the detective. When Marcus Hale mentioned the possibility that someone else might have discovered the blackmail, Raymond paled visibly. It was then that the detective noticed something that had gone unnoticed until that moment. Raymond's daughter, Susan Lester, had access to all the information Becky planned to use against her father. Final confession. Susan Lester. The truth about Becky Lester's death emerged in a tense and emotionally charged interrogation. Susan Lester, Raymond's daughter, finally confessed her involvement in the crime after forensic evidence and a reconstruction of the timeline left little doubt of her guilt. Sitting across from Detective Marcus Hale, her eyes swollen from crying and her hands shaking uncontrollably, Susan admitted what she had done that fateful night. Her voice was barely a whisper, but each word echoed like a sinister echo in the room. Susan had accidentally discovered the letter Becky planned to use to blackmail her father. While searching Becky's desk for something, she found the envelope and couldn't help but read it. What she read filled her with a mixture of anger and despair. Becky was not only ruining her father's life with her threats, she was also having an affair with Adam Guilford, something Susan interpreted as outright betrayal. To her, Becky was nothing more than an interloper who had destroyed the memory of her biological mother, Jackie, and was now trying to destroy her father. She decided to act, convinced that she was protecting her family. That night, Susan returned to her father's house after pretending to be at her grandfather's house. She knew Becky would be alone, as Raymond usually fell asleep by the pool after drinking. She crept up the back stairs as Becky walked to her room. At that moment, Susan pulled out the cane she always carried with her, an object she occasionally used because of knee problems, and repeatedly struck Becky in the head. The impacts were brutal but inaccurate. Although they caused 5 severe lacerations, they did not fracture the skull due to the lack of force in the blows. However, they were enough to render Becky unconscious and cause her death by exsanguination minutes later. But Susan didn't stop there. She knew she had to cover up her crime, so she hastily cleaned up the scene using a paper towel to remove the most obvious traces of blood. He then dragged Becky's body to the foot of the stairs, trying to pass her death off as an accident. However, in his haste, he made crucial mistakes. He forgot that Becky's feet had not been in contact with the blood, making it clear that someone else had moved the body. In addition, the cane used in the attack contained traces of Becky's blood and hair, evidence that Susan did not have time to completely destroy. After cleaning up what she could, Susan took the cane and returned to her grandfather's house, where she hid it in the hall closet. She thought no one would suspect her, especially since she had pretended to be away from the crime scene. But forensic evidence doesn't lie. During the investigation, the team discovered a bloody shirt in the closet of the grandfather's house along with the cane. DNA analysis confirmed that the blood belonged to Becky, and the fibers on the shirt matched those found at the crime scene. In addition, the blackmail letter envelope contained Becky's fingerprints, validating that she was the author of the document Susan had read. Detective Marcus Hale confronted Susan with this irrefutable evidence. At first, she tried to deny everything, clinging to her initial alibi. But when the detective mentioned the cane and the bloody shirt, Susan collapsed emotionally. She admitted to acting out of love for her father, convinced that she was saving him from destruction. However, her version of events revealed an impulsive and desperate mind, someone who had allowed her hatred for Becky to cloud her judgment. Timeline reconstruction was key to confirming her guilt. A neighbor's security cameras captured Susan's car entering and leaving Maple Street that night, contradicting her claim to have been at her grandfather's house the entire time. In addition, activity logs on her phone showed that she had been near her father's house shortly before Becky's estimated time of death. These details sealed his fate. When Susan finished her confession, Detective Hale felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. He had solved the case, but the truth was far grimmer than he had imagined. Susan was not a cold, calculating killer. She was an impulsive young woman who had allowed her pain and resentment to drive her to commit an irreparable act. Her motivation was not pure hatred, but a deep need to protect her father, even if it meant crossing a line that should never have been crossed. With Susan's confession, the Becky Lester case came to a head. The pieces of the puzzle finally fit together, revealing a family tragedy that had been fueled by secrets, betrayal, and misguided love. Now all that remained was to face the legal and emotional consequences of this dark chapter. Case 2. The night in the Arizona desert was unusually quiet, except for the insistent barking of Mr. and Mrs. Copeland's dog. The high-pitched, repetitive sound awakened the elderly couple, who lived in a modest house on the outskirts of a small town. Mr. Copeland, a 72-year-old man with graying hair and hands gnarled from a lifetime's work, cautiously got out of bed. The barking was coming from the backyard, but something else caught his attention. A dull, metallic clanking sound that seemed to be coming from the kitchen. When he arrived on the scene, what he found paralyzed him. A group of unknown people, dressed in long, loose-fitting white coats, were ransacking his refrigerator. Bottles of water, cans of food, and anything non-perishable they could carry were being dragged into makeshift bags. Before Mr. Copeland could react, the group quickly fled out the back door, leaving an icy void in the kitchen. But what he saw next made him recoil, his heart pounding. A few meters from the house near a dry bush, there was a body lying on the ground. The victim, a young man with multiple severe wounds, appeared to have been dragged there from another location. His clothes were torn, covered with blood and dirt, as if he had been brutally attacked before he died. The most disturbing thing was to notice that someone had tried to cover the body with an old sheet, as if they wanted to hide it in a hurry. Mr. Copeland called the police immediately. Detective Ethan Graves, an experienced man with an impeccable reputation for complex cases, was the first on the scene. Upon seeing the scene, he knew immediately that this was no ordinary crime. On the ground, shoe prints marked a clear path to and from the body, indicating that several people had been involved in transporting it. Near a lone tree, a candy wrapper stuck to the bark suggested that the group had an affinity for junk food, a seemingly insignificant but intriguing detail. Graves examined the body carefully. He noticed traces of blood and tissue on the tips of the victim's shoes, indicating that he had been dragged through the desert for a considerable distance. But what really captured his attention was a trail of evidence leading beyond the Copeland's property. Following the tracks, Graves and his team discovered a burned-out car 3 miles away. The charred remains of the vehicle showed evidence of a Molotov cocktail used to set it on fire, and inside the car they found fragments of personal items belonging to the deceased, including a smashed cell phone and a singed white coat. But the most chilling part was yet to be discovered. Following additional leads in the desert, Graves located an abandoned bunker hidden among the dunes. Inside, they found a macabre scene. 11 bodies lying on cots, all apparently dead from overdoses of ketamine mixed with vodka and hallucinogens. Some of the cots were empty, suggesting that members of the group were missing. Who were these people? What had led them to this fatal fate? And most importantly, what connection did they have to the victim found in the Copeland's yard? The case was far from a simple murder. It was a puzzle filled with secrets, rituals, and a level of organization that defied logic. Detective Graves knew he was looking at something much bigger than he had imagined, and that each clue brought them a little closer to the truth behind this tragedy in the desert. Ty Bentley, was a 25-year-old employed at a car rental agency in the nearby town. He was known for his friendly attitude and dedication to his job, although in the weeks leading up to his death, his co-workers noticed that he seemed distracted. Ty was obsessed with finding his ex-girlfriend Emma after learning that she planned to move away. They had broken up months earlier, but Ty had not been able to get over the breakup. In his search, Detective Graves began to review the agency's client records, something unusual for him. His last client on record was Joseph Diamond. Detective Graves knew that this connection between Ty, Emma, and Joseph Diamond was key to understanding what had happened. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Ty Bentley's ex-girlfriend Emma was found in a local hospital. She was showing symptoms of intoxication from the same cocktail of ketamine, vodka, and hallucinogens that had killed the 11 bodies in the bunker. Although weak and disoriented, Emma survived because she had vomited some of the substance before losing consciousness. However, the after effects of the experience were evident. Her eyes were glazed over, her voice trembled, and her mind seemed trapped between fragmented memories and persistent hallucinations. During interrogation, Emma admitted to being a member of a cult. According to her testimony, the cult was planning a mass suicide as part of a ritual to ascend to a higher plane of existence. Emma described how members had consumed the cocktail on the orders of the leader, who claimed it was necessary to achieve spiritual enlightenment. However, something went wrong during the ritual. Emma did not clearly remember what had happened after drinking the mixture, but she knew that she had begun to vomit and become extremely confused before passing out. When Detective Graves asked her about Ty, Emma broke down emotionally. She said she didn't remember seeing him, but she had vague flashes of his face in the midst of the chaos. She knew Ty had been looking for her, though she couldn't explain how or why. Her memories were fragmented, as if her mind was trying to block out what had happened. The only thing she could say with certainty was that Ty had been at the place where the ritual occurred. Emma wept inconsolably as she repeated that she didn't understand why Ty had gone there, or what part he had played in all of this. The interrogation took another turn when Graves mentioned Joseph Diamond. Emma confirmed that Joseph was the leader of the cult, a charismatic but manipulative man who had convinced his followers that mass suicide was the only way to escape a corrupt world. According to Emma, Joseph had promised to lead them to a new life filled with peace and harmony, but now she suspected that it had all been a lie. Her own survival led her to question everything she had believed up to that point. Despite her confusion, Emma provided key details about the bunker and the events leading up to the ritual. She described how the cult members lived in isolation in the desert, strictly following the rules imposed by Joseph. She also mentioned that some had begun to doubt the ascension plan, but Joseph had convinced them to go ahead with promises of salvation. Emma could not explain what had led Ty to the bunker, but her testimony made it clear that Joseph Diamond was a central figure in this case. Detective Graves knew Emma wasn't completely guilty, but she wasn't innocent either. Her involvement in the cult and her connection to Ty suggested that there were more pieces of the puzzle to be discovered. Now, the focus of the investigation was on Joseph Diamond, the leader of the cult and possibly responsible for the death of Ty and the other members, and who was not among the dead. At another nearby hospital, authorities found Matthew Dickens, a 21-year-old college student who had the same symptoms of intoxication as Emma. Like her, Matthew had survived by vomiting up some of the cocktail of ketamine, vodka, and hallucinogens before losing consciousness. However, his testimony added crucial new details to the investigation. Matthew admitted to being recruited by the cult months earlier, specifically by a woman named Abigail Spencer. According to his account, Abigail had contacted him on the college campus under the guise of offering him spiritual answers and a sense of belonging. Dazzled by promises of enlightenment and mental freedom, Matthew joined the group without suspecting that he would end up involved in a deadly ritual. Although initially attracted to the cult's ideas, he soon began to doubt the intentions of Joseph Diamond, the charismatic but controlling leader who directed the members with a firm hand. During the interrogation, Matthew revealed that he remembered fragments of what happened the night of the ritual. In the midst of his hallucinations, he claimed to have seen Ty Bentley's body in the bunker. According to his testimony, He tried to save him by dragging him out of the place, believing he was still alive. The extreme physical exertion caused him intense nausea, which led him to vomit up much of the toxic substance and eventually save his life. Matthew did not remember exactly where he had dragged the body to, but confirmed that he had left it somewhere in the desert near the bunker. Matthew's testimony matched the physical evidence found by Detective Graves. Drag marks and traces of blood and tissue on Ty's shoes suggested that someone had moved him after his death. In addition, the old sheet used to cover the body had probably been placed by Matthew in a desperate attempt to protect or hide him during his hallucinatory confusion. When asked about Abigail Spencer, Matthew described a manipulative woman who acted as the cult's chief recruiter. From the beginning of the investigation, Detective Ethan Graves had suspected Joseph Diamond as the central figure behind the tragedy in the desert. However, when he attempted to locate him, Joseph had disappeared without a trace. There were no recent records of his whereabouts and no activity in his known bank accounts. This led the team to delve deeper into Joseph's finances and cult members, looking for any links that might explain his motivation. What they found was chilling. Each of the 11 bodies found in the bunker, as well as Matthew Dickens and Emma, had transferred virtually all of their assets to Joseph prior to the ritual. The transactions included bank accounts, property, vehicles, and even small personal investments. In some cases, the transfers had been made only days before the failed mass suicide. This was no coincidence. Joseph had been orchestrating an elaborate scam under the guise of a charismatic spiritual leader. Detective Graves quickly pieced together the sequence of events. Joseph Diamond was not an enlightened guru, but a professional con man who used psychological manipulation to recruit vulnerable people and convince them to turn their assets over to him. The Ascension ritual was nothing more than a front to cover up multiple murders. Joseph knew that by administering a lethal dose of the cocktail of ketamine, vodka, and hallucinogens, he would ensure the death of all cult members, leaving little chance that anyone could report him. However, something went wrong. Emma and Matthew survived because they vomited some of the substance, which exposed his plan. Joseph's disappearance confirmed that he never intended to die with his followers. Joseph Diamond seemed to have managed to disappear without a trace. With millions of dollars in assets transferred into his name and a meticulously woven web of deceit, his initial plan had been nearly flawless. However, fate had other plans. Just as Detective Ethan Graves was beginning to lose hope of finding fresh leads, a new case came to his attention. Another person intoxicated with the same deadly cocktail had been found in a nearby hospital. Abigail Spencer's appearance at the hospital changed the course of the investigation. Although she was weak and struggling to recover from the effects of the deadly cocktail, her testimony provided a shocking revelation that confirmed Detective Ethan Graves' worst suspicions. Abigail was a 26-year-old who had been recruited by Joseph Diamond nearly a year earlier and quickly rose through the ranks within the cult to become one of its top recruiters. Her charisma and ability to manipulate vulnerable people made her a key part of Joseph's plan. During cross-examination, Abigail admitted that she remembered fragments of what happened the night of the ritual. Under the influence of drugs, she claimed to have witnessed Joseph Diamond murder Ty Bentley. According to her testimony, Ty had attempted to call the police after discovering the true purpose of the ritual and confronting Joseph. In a desperate act to protect his operation, Joseph brutally beat Ty unconscious and then dragged him into the bunker, along with the other members. It was then that he ordered Abigail to burn Ty's car to eliminate any evidence that could link him to the crime. Abigail described how Joseph manipulated her to accomplish this task. Under the effects of ketamine and hallucinogens, she firmly believed she was doing the right thing to protect the mission of the group. However, now sober and facing the consequences of her actions, she broke down emotionally as she admitted her involvement. She said she never imagined Joseph would take things this far, and had always believed the ritual would be a spiritual experience, not a premeditated massacre. Abigail's testimony also revealed crucial details about Joseph's last movements before his disappearance. According to her, Joseph had been planning his escape for weeks. He used money transferred by cult members to buy false identities and book international tickets under different names. Abigail mentioned that Joseph had contacts abroad and was probably already on his way to a country without extradition treaties with the United States. Detective Graves knew that this testimony was a key piece in closing the case. With Abigail's confession, it was clear that Joseph Diamond was not only a con man, but also a cold and calculating killer. He had used the cult's ideology to justify his crimes, but his true motivation had always been money and power. Although Joseph remained at large, Abigail's testimony provided enough evidence to issue an international arrest warrant. Graves's team worked quickly to track Joseph's recent financial transactions and locate possible destinations. They knew it was only a matter of time before he made a mistake. Something popped into Detective Ethan Graves's mind when he reviewed Abigail Spencer's medical records. Unlike Emma and Matthew, who had survived by vomiting up some of the deadly cocktail, Abigail showed no signs of having expelled the substance. In addition, the drug levels in her system were significantly lower than those of the other victims. This led Graves to suspect that Abigail had intentionally consumed less in order to remain lucid, while the others succumbed to the poison. He decided to investigate her further. The case took an unexpected turn when Joseph Diamond's body was found in the trunk of Abigail's car, parked in her own home. Along with his body was a belt full of bundles of cash and several pills. This finding confirmed that Joseph had attempted to flee with the stolen goods, but something or someone had stopped him before he could escape. During the interrogation, Graves pushed Abigail to her emotional limit. Finally, she collapsed and confessed the full truth. She admitted that she had used a combination of injectable liquid ketamine and vodka to poison the members of the group, a lethal mixture designed to simulate a mass suicide. According to Abigail, she believed strongly in the cult's cause at first, but everything changed when Ty Bentley tried to call the police during the ritual. At that point, Abigail acted on instinct, murdering Ty to protect what she considered the mission. However, after committing the crime, Joseph panicked and revealed the truth to her. The whole thing had been a scam from the beginning. There was no promotion, just an elaborate scheme to steal the members' assets and disappear. Disappointed and betrayed, Abigail decided to act. When Joseph tried to flee with the money and false identities he had prepared, she confronted him. Using an iron bar found in the bunker, she repeatedly beat Joseph to death. She then placed his body in the trunk of her own car, along with the belt full of money and pills, ensuring that he would never be able to escape with the stolen goods. Graves also uncovered chilling details about the method used to poison cult members. Joseph had chosen the date of the ritual to coincide with the Orionid meteor shower, a celestial event he used to manipulate his followers and reinforce his spiritual ascension narrative. However, the plan went awry when Abigail decided to betray Joseph and take control of the group. With this confession, it became clear that Abigail Spencer was not simply a manipulated follower, but a central figure in the events that led to the deaths of Ty Bentley and Joseph Diamond. Her ambition and thirst for revenge drove her to commit heinous acts, although she claimed she did so to expose the truth behind the cult. Abigail Spencer's trial captured the attention of the small town and national media, exposing the dark details of the cult, the mass poisoning and murders of Ty Bentley and Joseph Diamond. During the trial, Abigail pleaded guilty to charges of involuntary manslaughter by cult members, arguing that she had acted under the influence of Joseph's manipulations and her own initial belief in the cause. However, she was unable to justify Joseph's premeditated murder or the brutal attack on Ty, leading the jury to find her guilty of second-degree murder for these crimes. The court also took into account her role as a key recruiter for the cult and her active participation in the mass poisoning. Ultimately, Abigail was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole for the multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and illegal possession of intoxicants. Although her confession and cooperation with authorities spared her an even harsher sentence, it was clear that she would spend most of her life behind bars. For Detective Graves, the case served as a grim reminder of the destructive power of manipulation and greed, while for the community, it marked the end of a nightmare that had left indelible scars on all involved. Case 3, An anonymous 911 call alerted authorities to a strange find at a home in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. When Detective Marcus Hale arrived on the scene, he found a scene that defied logic. On the floor of a cluttered room lay the body of a man covered almost entirely with hair. His appearance was so unusual that, at first glance, some officers doubted whether they were looking at a human being or some kind of animal creature. The body belonged to Hayden Bradford, a 38-year-old man with hypertrichosis, an extremely rare genetic disorder that caused excessive hair growth all over his body. Although his condition had made him notoriously well known in the community, it had also isolated him socially for much of his life. However, what really shocked the forensic team was not his appearance but the cause of death. A precise shot to the chest caused by a silver bullet. The presence of a silver bullet added a disturbing nuance to the case. Why would someone use such an unusual projectile to commit murder? Speculation began to surface immediately. Some pointed to superstition, others to possible acts of revenge or even ritual. Detective Hale knew this case would not be like the others. There was something deliberate, almost symbolic in the choice of weapon and target. And as he looked at Hayden Bradford's body under the cold light of the forensic spotlights, Hale knew he was about to step into a mystery that would test his experience and instincts. Rouge. In his 30s, Hayden was a man living on the edge, both in his lifestyle and his health. He suffered from hypertrichosis, an extremely rare genetic disorder that caused excessive hair growth all over his body. This condition had marked him since childhood, making him notoriously well known in the community, but also an easy target for ridicule and prejudice. Although he had learned to deal with the curious stares and cruel comments, his appearance had always kept him on the fringes of society. Professionally, Hayden did not have a steady job. Instead, he made a living as an occasional gambler in online casinos. He was skilled with numbers and had an exceptional memory, which allowed him to win more times than he lost. However, this lifestyle kept him in a constant financial seesaw, alternating between periods of stability and times of financial stress. His irregular income and solitary lifestyle made him seem like a mysterious man, even to those who knew him superficially. On the personal front, Hayden was engaged to Michelle, the sister of his close friend Brent Martin. The presence of a silver bullet in Hayden's body added an unsettling nuance to the investigation. Detective Hale knew this detail could not be ignored. Was it possible that someone had attacked Hayden because of superstitions related to his physical condition? Hypertrichosis, although scientifically explained, had often been associated in popular culture with myths about werewolves or supernatural creatures. This raised the possibility that the killer had deliberately chosen a silver bullet as a symbolic act, perhaps influenced by these mistaken beliefs. At the crime scene, Detective Marcus Hale identified several clues that could be crucial to solving the case. Large tufts of human hair were scattered both inside and outside the house, possibly pulled out during a fight or struggle. A broken window with a nearby stone suggested that someone had attempted to gain access to the property by force. In the backyard, a gun was found buried, although ballistics tests confirmed that it was not the gun used to kill Hayden. On a table, there were photos of Hayden with a woman named Michelle, confirming their romantic relationship before his death. On Hayden's computer, a threatening email was found from someone named Casino Dan, accusing him of not paying a $10,000 debt. These clues began to paint a clearer picture. Hayden was involved in dangerous situations, from personal conflicts to financial problems related to his gambling activities. Detective Hale knew that each of these elements had to be thoroughly investigated to unravel who wanted him dead. As the team investigated the house for more clues, a false panel in the hallway caught their attention. Opening it, they discovered a tiny room, dimly lit by melted candles. In the center, sitting on a narrow bed, was Elisa Bradford, Hayden's twin sister. Her body was covered with a dense layer of hair, even more prominent than her brother's. Her eyes, puffy and glazed, avoided any eye contact with the investigators. She trembled slightly, as if every movement was an imminent threat. During the interrogation, Elisa shrank back in her seat, hugging herself as memories seemed to wash over her. The walls of her secret room were covered with old photographs and yellowed newspaper clippings, many of them showing images of her and Hayden as children. In some photos, both were smiling, but in others, their faces reflected sadness. Investigators noticed tear marks on some of the photos, as if Alika had cried over them repeatedly. When asked about her relationship with Hayden, Alika looked down at her trembling hands. In her mind, she relived the years of school taunts, the shouts of monster and witch, the stones thrown as they ran home. She remembered how, after years of abuse, she decided to hide in that room where no one could see her or hurt her. Hayden was her only link to the outside world, the one who brought her food and news of what was happening beyond the four walls that protected her. But now that he was dead, Alika feared for her own life. Her hands clutched tightly at the edges of her t-shirt as she tried to hold back tears. Investigators also discovered that Alika firmly believed that someone had killed Hayden because of superstitions. In her mind, the use of a silver bullet was no coincidence. She herself had heard stories of people associating hypertrichosis with werewolves or supernatural creatures. Her fear was palpable. Every time an investigator moved into the room, she shrank even more, as if expecting to be attacked at any moment. When asked about Michelle and Brent, Alika shook her head slowly. She said she had never met them in person, although she knew they had always been good to Hayden. In her trembling voice, there was a hint of gratitude for them, but also a shadow of jealousy. She felt that Hayden was moving away from her, leaving her alone in that little shelter she had built to protect herself from the world. The idea that he was planning to move in with Michelle must have terrified her, investigators thought, but they found no evidence that she had acted out of jealousy. However, something caught Detective Marcus Hale's attention. Under Alika's bed, they found traces of blood. When it was mentioned to him, she broke down emotionally. Hands shaking, she explained that she had tried to clean up the blood after finding Hayden's body. Not because she was guilty, but because she feared she would be blamed due to her isolation and strangeness. Forensic tests confirmed that the blood belonged exclusively to Hayden, with no traces of Alika's DNA or signs that she had used a weapon. This, along with her consistent testimony, ultimately exonerated her of any involvement in the murder. The next name on the list of persons of interest was Dan Nobler, a middle-aged man whose impeccable appearance, a tight dark suit, a perfectly knotted tie, and an expensive watch on his wrist, seemed designed to convey authority. Beneath that facade of professionalism, however, was an intensity that did not go unnoticed by Detective Marcus Hale. Dan was the manager of an online casino site where Hayden Bradford had accumulated significant debt. But what initially appeared to be a simple case of irresponsible gambling soon revealed darker layers. According to financial records obtained by the investigative team, Hayden had lost thousands of dollars at the online casino managed by Dan. However, rather than accept his defeat, Hayden had resorted to a fraudulent claim, alleging that his account had been hacked and that the lost funds should be refunded. To Dan's surprise, the casino's dispute resolution system had ruled in Hayden's favor, allowing him to recover a substantial portion of his money. This represented not only a considerable financial loss for Dan, but also a direct hit to his reputation as a manager. In the world of online casinos where trust was key, a case like this could generate distrust among users and investors. When Detective Marcus Hale summoned him for questioning, Dan arrived with a defensive but calculated attitude. He was trying to maintain a neutral expression, although his hands were shaking slightly as he flipped through some documents he had brought with him, presumably to prove his innocence. During the interrogation, it became clear that Dan was furious about Hayden's scam. According to phone call records and messages obtained by the investigative team, Dan had repeatedly threatened Hayden, demanding that he pay the debt or face the consequences. One such message read, "No one cheats me and gets away with it." The intensity of these words left Detective Hale with the impression that Dan was not someone who would easily tolerate being challenged. What caught the detective's attention most was Dan's confession about his visit to Hayden's house days before the murder. He admitted going there to confront him, but claimed that the argument had not escalated to physical violence. According to Dan, Hayden had been arrogant during their encounter, mocking him and reiterating that he had no intention of paying the debt. Although Dan admitted to losing his temper, he insisted that he would never have resorted to murder. His version of events was that he simply walked out of the house after the argument, leaving Hayden alive. The investigative team meticulously reviewed the evidence related to Dan. His cell phone records confirmed that he had been at Hayden's home at the aforementioned time, but also showed that he had been at a work meeting at the estimated time of the murder. In addition, security cameras from a nearby business captured images of Dan leaving Hayden's home hours before the crime. This evidence, along with the lack of physical connection between Dan and the crime scene, led Detective Hale to rule him out as a suspect. Although Dan was not involved in the murder, his relationship with Hayden provided important context about the financial and personal tensions surrounding the victim's life. The detective knew the case was still far from solved, but each piece of the puzzle helped bring him a little closer to the truth. Dan's anger, while genuine, had not crossed the line into murder. However, his presence in Hayden's life made it clear that the victim had been swimming in dangerous waters, surrounded by people who had reason to want to hurt him. Next on the list of persons of interest was Brent Martin, one of Hayden's closest friends since high school. Brent had been there through Hayden's most difficult times, including the teasing and rejection they had both faced because of their friend's hypertrichosis condition. Although Brent did not share the same physical appearance as Hayden, he had always defended him with unwavering loyalty. It was he who introduced Hayden to Michelle, his future fiancée, and who tried to help him build a normal life despite the difficulties. When questioned by Detective Marcus Hale, Brent seemed genuinely affected by his friend's death. His eyes were bloodshot, as if he had spent hours crying, and his voice trembled as he spoke. Yet there was also something tense in his posture, as if he carried an invisible weight on his shoulders. During the interrogation, Brent admitted to having been at Hayden's house on the day of the murder, but claimed that his presence there had been entirely accidental. According to his version, he had been playing baseball with friends near the property when he accidentally broke one of the back windows of the house. He explained that he tried to get inside to clean up the mess before Hayden noticed, but found no one inside. What struck the detective most was the way Brent described the constant threats Hayden had faced throughout his life. Brent explained that there had always been people who considered Hayden an abomination because of his appearance. Religious and superstitious fanatics pointed to him as an evil figure, someone to be feared or eliminated. "I always defended him," Brent said, with a mixture of sadness and frustration in his voice. "But this time I couldn't protect him. I'm sure it was one of them. Someone who thought he was doing the right thing by killing him." Brent also mentioned that the situation had worsened after Hayden began planning his future with Michelle. According to him, some of Hayden's detractors had interpreted his engagement as provocative, as if he was openly defying the social norms they were trying to impose on him. This theory resonated with Detective Hale, especially when he recalled the silver bullet used in the murder. Could it be possible that someone had attacked Hayden driven by irrational beliefs? Understood. Let's adjust the information to be consistent with the fact that Brent didn't know about Elisa's existence, and focus on Hayden's concerns about what to do with his sister after the wedding, as well as recent tensions between him and Brent. I will keep the tone visual and dynamic. Michelle's interrogation. The next person on the list of interest was Michelle, Hayden's fiancée and Brent Martin's sister. From the moment she entered the interrogation room, Michelle radiated a mixture of grief and emotional exhaustion. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her hands trembled slightly as she fiddled with a crumpled handkerchief between her fingers. Although she tried to remain composed, it was clear that the loss of Hayden had devastated her. During the interrogation, Michelle revealed something that caught Detective Marcus Hale's attention. She explained that in the days leading up to the murder, Hayden had confided in her a concern that plagued him: what to do with Elisa, his twin sister, after the wedding. According to Michelle, Hayden was anxious about how to balance his new life with her without leaving her alone or exposing her to the outside world. "I knew I had to make a decision, but I didn't want to hurt her," Michelle said, her voice breaking. It was like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. What intrigued the detective most was when Michelle mentioned that recently, Hayden and Brent had been angry. She didn't go into specific details, but stated that she had noticed a growing tension between them. According to Michelle, Brent had begun acting distant and hostile toward Hayden, although she didn't know exactly why. What she did know was that this situation had alarmed her so much that she had tried to warn Hayden about his brother. "I told him to be careful," Michelle explained with a mixture of guilt and frustration. "I didn't trust Brent lately. I felt something wasn't right." Michelle also admitted to repeatedly calling Hayden in the days leading up to the murder, attempting to talk to him about her concerns. However, when asked to provide an alibi for the time of the crime, she was unable to prove her whereabouts. She said she had been home alone, checking on wedding preparations, but there were no witnesses who could confirm this. Despite these inconsistencies, the investigative team found no evidence directly connecting Michelle to the murder. Forensic tests showed no traces of her DNA at the crime scene, and her phone records confirmed that she had attempted to contact Hayden several times prior to his death. In addition, Michelle seemed genuinely concerned for Hayden's safety even before the murder. Her motivation for killing him made no sense. She was deeply committed to him and had struggled for years to build a life together, overcoming the difficulties caused by his hypertrichosis condition. Although Michelle was ruled out as a suspect, her testimony added a new layer of complexity to the case. The tension between Hayden and Brent, along with Hayden's concerns about Alika, led Detective Hale to reconsider Brent's role in the crime. What had triggered Brent's anger toward Hayden? Could it be related to Hayden's plans to move out and start a new life, leaving behind any connection to the past? The detective knew he needed to dig even deeper into the relationship between the two men to find answers. The investigation led the CSI team to discover that Brent Martin, Hayden's close friend and Michelle's brother, was the culprit in the murder. During an intense interrogation, Brent finally admitted to shooting Hayden with a silver bullet manufactured specifically for the crime. His motive was devastating in its simplicity. He wanted to prevent Hayden from marrying Michelle and passing on his hereditary disease, hypertrichosis, to the couple's future children. To Brent, this act was not just a hate-driven crime, but a cold, calculated solution to protect his sister from what he considered an insurmountable genetic threat. The case gained momentum when investigators found hard evidence in Brent's home. In a dark corner of his workshop, hidden behind seemingly innocuous tools and materials, they found silver chips and remnants of molds used to make bullets. Forensic analysis confirmed that these materials were a perfect match to the composition of the bullet that had killed Hayden. It was clear that Brent had meticulously planned the crime, deliberately choosing a silver bullet as a symbol of his contempt for Hayden's condition. To him, silver was not just a metal. It represented an irrational connection between hypertrichosis and werewolf myths, an association that reflected his ignorance and prejudice toward the genetic disease. Allison's testimony was crucial to solving the case, although her involvement was marked by fear and uncertainty. Although she had initially withheld information, fearing retaliation or involvement in something bigger than herself, she finally decided to speak out. In a shaky but firm voice, Allison identified Brent as the person she had seen near Hayden's house in the days leading up to the murder. She explained that she had noticed his strange behavior during his visits to the neighborhood, including how he moved stealthily and appeared to be watching something or someone. Although Allison did not personally know Brent or fully understand his relationship with Hayden, her detailed and accurate description allowed investigators to connect him directly to the crime. Without her intervention, the case might have gone unsolved. Eventually, Brent was arrested and charged with premeditated murder. During interrogation, he admitted that he had chosen a silver bullet because he associated Hayden's condition with werewolf myths, believing that this symbolized a kind of purification. This chilling detail made it clear that the crime had not only been premeditated, but was loaded with irrational symbolism and contempt for Hayden's genetic disease. For Brent, this act was not simply murder, but a way to impose his distorted view of what was right for his family. The case highlights how prejudice and mistaken beliefs can lead to devastating decisions. Brent, who had once been Hayden's most loyal defender against bigots and superstitious people, ended up being consumed by his own fears and insecurities. His obsession with protecting Michelle blinded him, leading him to commit an irreparable act that destroyed not only Hayden's life, but also the trust and stability of his own family. Case 4. Detective Ethan Graves was called to a home located on the outskirts of the city after a neighbor reported hearing a loud gunshot coming from the residence's garage. Upon arriving at the scene, he found a scene that initially appeared to be the result of a crime of passion or even an accident. However, as he began to analyze the details, it became clear that there was something much darker behind the death of Aaron, whose body lay on the cold garage floor with a fatal leg wound. The cause of death was quickly identified, a precise shot that perforated a major artery, causing massive hemorrhaging. At first glance, Graves thought it might have been an accidental shooting or an impulsive act. But as he began to examine the scene, the clues began to paint a much more complex picture. A trail of blood marked the path from the garage to the front door of the house. It was evident that Aaron had tried to escape after being wounded, crawling desperately while losing large amounts of blood. This detail contradicted the idea of an accident. Clearly, someone had attacked him, and he had fought for his life until the last moment. Near the entrance to the house, Graves noticed something unusual. The telephone wires had been deliberately cut. This was not a random or accidental act. Whoever had been behind the murder was trying to make sure that Aaron could not call for help or communicate with the outside world. The detective began to suspect that the crime had been carefully planned, eliminating any possibility that the victim could contact someone for help. In the garage near the body, he found a bullet casing that would be crucial for the investigation. Ballistic analysis confirmed that the weapon used was a common model, but what was really striking was the precision of the shot. It did not appear to be an impulsive act. The killer knew exactly where to aim to inflict a fatal wound without killing instantly. This suggested that the killer wanted Aaron to suffer before he died, adding a level of premeditated cruelty to the crime. While going through Aaron's belongings, Graves discovered that he had an ex-girlfriend with whom he had had a complicated relationship. Although he did not yet have direct evidence linking her to the crime, her name appeared repeatedly in Aaron's phone records and recent messages. Conversations between them showed signs of tension, with messages suggesting that she was upset about something related to him. As the detective began to piece together the events of that night, it became clear that this case was not as simple as it first appeared. The combination of clues, the blood trail, the severed wires, the bullet casing, and the possible involvement of the ex-girlfriend pointed to a premeditated crime, loaded with intent and perhaps motivated by intense emotions such as spite or revenge. Ethan Graves knew he would need to delve deeper into Aaron's personal life to understand what had driven someone to commit such a brutal act. In the meantime, the garage remained a chilling reminder of Aaron's last struggle to survive, a space where every drop of blood and every footprint left behind told a story that had yet to unravel. The first person on the list of suspects was Bianca, Aaron's ex-girlfriend. From the moment Detective Ethan Graves began investigating her, it was clear that she was no ordinary ex-girlfriend. Bianca had an almost unhealthy obsession with keeping Aaron under her control, even after their relationship had ended. Friends and acquaintances described her as manipulative and possessive, someone who wouldn't take no for an answer. According to phone records and messages recovered from Aaron's phone, Bianca had been trying to contact him repeatedly in the days leading up to the murder, sending him messages filled with veiled threats and emotional appeals. During the interrogation, Bianca appeared defensive but calculating, as if she was measuring every word before speaking. She claimed to be at a nightclub with her friends during the time of the murder, even providing names and details to back up her alibi. However, evidence began to contradict his version of events. Security cameras in a nearby neighborhood captured images of her car returning home much earlier than she had stated. In addition, a witness mentioned seeing her vehicle near Aaron's residence that night, although he could not confirm whether she was inside. What caught the detective's attention most was Bianca's partial confession during the interrogation. She finally admitted that she had asked Tom to intimidate Aaron, although she insisted that she never meant for him to be physically hurt. "I just wanted him to know that he couldn't replace me that easily," he said, with a mixture of arrogance and nervousness in his voice. This statement made it clear that Bianca had taken active steps to exert control over Aaron, including using third parties to carry out her plans. Although Bianca was ruled out as the direct perpetrator of the murder, her indirect involvement could not be ignored. Forensic evidence confirmed that the weapon used in the crime was not linked to her, and her alibi, though fragile, could not be completely dismantled. However, her manipulative behavior and her decision to involve Tom to intimidate Aaron made her a key piece of the puzzle. Detective Graves knew he needed to dig deeper into this angle to understand exactly what had gone wrong that night and who had pulled the trigger that ended Aaron's life. Meanwhile, Bianca was marked as a central figure in the investigation, someone whose obsession and lack of emotional control had helped trigger a tragedy she never imagined. The next step in the investigation led Detective Ethan Graves to question Tom, a close friend of Bianca. From the outset, it was clear that Tom had a complicated relationship with her. During the interrogation, he admitted that he had been Bianca's boyfriend in the past, and that, although their official relationship had ended, they were still sleeping together occasionally. This irregular dynamic hinted at a confused and possibly toxic emotional connection between the two. When questioned about his whereabouts on the night of the murder, Tom claimed to be at home during the time of the crime. However, he was unable to provide witnesses to confirm his alibi, leaving Detective Graves with some doubts about his version of events. What he did admit, under duress, was that Bianca had asked him to intimidate Aaron on several occasions. According to Tom, he complied with some of those requests, but always within what he considered reasonable limits. He insisted that he never intended to physically hurt Aaron, only to scare him into stopping ignoring Bianca. Most revealing in his testimony was how he described Bianca. She was obsessed with keeping it under control, Tom said, with a mixture of frustration and some discomfort. I warned her that she was crazy, that this wasn't going to end well, but she wouldn't listen. He just wanted Aaron back in his life, as if that were possible after all he'd done. This comment painted a clear picture of Bianca, someone who accepted no boundaries when it came to taking back what she believed was hers. But Tom also revealed something disturbing about his own experience with Bianca. After he tried to resume his relationship with her a few months ago, someone bullied him into walking away. That someone was Justin Cole, a man hired by Bianca to make him understand that he no longer had a place in her life. It was exactly the same thing he did with Aaron, Tom explained, bitterness in his voice. I realized that she doesn't change. She always uses other people to do her dirty work. So I decided to walk away completely. I didn't want to end up like Aaron. This new information reinforced Detective Graves's perception of Bianca, a manipulative and dangerous woman who did not hesitate to use third parties to exert control over those around her. Although Tom denied any direct involvement in the murder, his involvement in the actions leading up to the crime made him a relevant figure to the investigation. In addition, his testimony pointed to Justin Cole as another possible actor involved in the network of intimidation orchestrated by Bianca. With this new testimony, it was clear that Bianca had woven a web of manipulation involving both Tom and Aaron, and now apparently Justin Cole as well. For Detective Graves, each piece of the puzzle was beginning to fit, but he had yet to identify who had crossed the finish line and pulled the trigger that ended Aaron's life. The next name on the list of suspects was Justin Cole, a former cohabitant of Bianca's with a troubled past. According to police records, Justin had a criminal record for rape and drug possession, making him a figure of high interest to Detective Ethan Graves. However, during questioning, Justin adamantly denied the allegations that landed him in prison. I never raped anyone, he stated firmly, although his tone revealed some bitterness. He explained that Bianca had denounced him years before because he refused to do something she wanted. She's a fiery madwoman, he said, with a mixture of resentment and disdain. She liked to pretend things, like it was some kind of twisted game, and I always fell for it. But when I stopped playing along, she accused me of something I never did. What caught the detective's attention most was Justin's admission that he had bullied Tom on Bianca's orders. According to him, Bianca specifically asked him to scare Tom away from her after he tried to resume their relationship. "I only did what she asked me to do," Justin assured. "But I never touched Aaron. I didn't even know who he was until all this was in the news." This statement was consistent with previous testimony from Tom, who mentioned that Justin had been the one in charge of bullying him. Although Justin denied any involvement in Aaron's murder, his criminal history and his link to Bianca kept him under suspicion. Detective Graves knew Justin was capable of violent acts, but the forensic evidence did not directly connect him to the crime. Moreover, his testimony seemed to sync up with Bianca's pattern of behavior, using others to do his dirty work while keeping his hands clean. With this new information, it was clear that Bianca had woven a web of manipulation involving both Tom and Justin, but the person directly responsible for the shooting that took Aaron's life had yet to be identified. For Detective Graves, each piece of the puzzle was beginning to fit together, but the case was not yet solved. Bianca's obsession, combined with her ability to manipulate those around her, had created a dangerous environment where anyone could have crossed the finish line. Roger that. Let's restructure the information about Chelsea by eliminating dialogue and maintaining a fluid, visual narrative tone. While investigating possible additional witnesses, Detective Ethan Graves received a report of a vehicle that had been stopped on a nearby highway while attempting to escape the city. Inside the car was Chelsea, Aaron's new girlfriend. Her condition reflected nervousness and fear, with obvious signs that she had been crying recently. During questioning, Chelsea admitted that she was running away out of fear of Bianca, whom she described as dangerous and obsessive. She expressed that she feared she would end up like Aaron if she did not stay away. Chelsea revealed that she had been at a nightclub the night of the murder, the same place where she claimed to have seen Bianca. According to her testimony, Bianca was accompanied by a group of people, although she was unable to identify anyone else clearly. This statement initially matched the alibi Bianca had provided, but previous evidence had already cast doubt on her version of events. One of the most revealing aspects of Chelsea's testimony was her admission of having been present during some of the occasions when Tom bullied Aaron. She explained that Aaron had downplayed these situations, assuring her that they were just threats of no consequence. However, Chelsea acknowledged that these actions had created an atmosphere of constant fear for Aaron. She described how Tom would verbally confront him in public places and, on some occasions, even follow him home. Although she never witnessed direct physical violence, it was clear that these intimidations had deeply affected Aaron. Chelsea also admitted that she had not reported these incidents before due to fear of getting involved or facing retaliation. However, after Aaron's death, she felt she could no longer remain silent. Her testimony reinforced the connection between Bianca and the orchestrated intimidation of Aaron, showing how her obsession had escalated into a tragedy. For Detective Graves, Chelsea's testimony was crucial. Not only did it confirm Tom's involvement in the intimidations, but it also underscored the fear Bianca was capable of instilling in those around her. Although Chelsea was not directly implicated in the murder, her account added another layer of complexity to the case. The web of manipulation and violence organized by Bianca was beginning to reveal its full extent, but the person directly responsible for the shooting that took Aaron's life had yet to be found. Crucial evidence came to Detective Ethan Graves after Justin Cole was injured. After his initial interrogation, Justin was attacked and wounded in the leg. When doctors treated his injury, they removed a bullet that, upon analysis, matched the weapon used to kill Aaron. This finding was the turning point that made it all make sense to the detective. With this new information, Graves understood that Justin was not the killer, but another victim of the same perpetrator. The connection between the murder weapon and Justin's wound confirmed that whoever had killed Aaron had also tried to eliminate Justin, probably to silence him, or because he knew too much. The detective mentally reconstructed the events. Someone else, someone with access to the gun and motive to get rid of both Aaron and Justin, was behind the crime. Justin had been wounded after his interrogation, suggesting that the killer was monitoring his movements and feared he would talk. It was now clear to the detective that the case was more complex than it initially appeared. Justin was not the culprit, but just another piece in the puzzle. The killer was still at large, and Graves knew he had to act fast before there were more victims. Detective Ethan Graves knew the pieces of the puzzle finally fit together when forensic evidence directly linked Bianca's friend Tom to Aaron's murder. Although Tom had initially claimed to be at home during the time of the crime, the evidence placed him at the crime scene without a doubt. The bullet casing found in the garage was a perfect match to Tom's gun, a pistol that he himself had admitted to owning. In addition, the telephone wires cut near Aaron's house showed that Tom had been carefully watching the place before the murder. This premeditated act made it clear that this was not an impulsive crime, but a carefully orchestrated plan to ensure that Aaron could not call for help or escape. The definitive connection came when the bullet removed from Justin's leg matched the gun used to kill Aaron. This confirmed that Tom was not only responsible for the murder, but also for the attack on Justin, likely to silence him after he began talking to authorities. Forensic analysis revealed that the bullet used to shoot Aaron was designed to maximize damage, puncturing a major artery in his leg and causing massive bleeding. This chilling detail suggested that the act was intentional and anger-laden, reflecting Tom's obsessive hatred of Aaron. During the interrogation, Tom finally confessed to shooting Aaron during a fight in the garage. According to his testimony, he had gone there with the intention of confronting and scaring him, as Bianca had asked him to do on multiple occasions. However, the situation escalated quickly. Aaron tried to defend himself, and in the struggle, Tom accidentally fired. Although he insisted that he did not intend to kill him, the result was devastating. The fatal shot punctured a major artery, leaving Aaron bleeding to death. The evidence also revealed that Tom had personal motives for wanting to eliminate Aaron. He was obsessed with the idea that if Aaron disappeared, Bianca would return to him. His possessive and jealous behavior led him to commit an irrational and violent act, believing that this would solve his emotional problems. In addition, his technical knowledge, evidenced by the cut telephone wires, showed that he had planned the crime with precision, making sure that Aaron could not communicate with anyone during the attack. Eventually, Tom was arrested and charged with premeditated murder. Although Bianca was not directly involved in the crime, her manipulative and possessive behavior contributed to the cycle of violence that led to the murder. She had used Tom as an instrument of her obsession, repeatedly sending him to intimidate Aaron without considering the consequences. The case against Tom went to court weeks after his arrest. During the trial, the prosecution presented a series of compelling evidence that left little room for doubt about his guilt. The bullet casing found in the garage, which matched his gun, was one of the key pieces of the prosecution's case. In addition, the severed telephone wires demonstrated premeditation, while the bullet taken from Justin's leg, which also matched his gun, directly linked him to both Aaron's murder and the subsequent attack on Justin. Tom's statement during cross-examination, in which he admitted to shooting Aaron during a fight in the garage, was used by the prosecution to argue that, although the shooting may not have been intentional at first, the act itself was the result of a premeditated confrontation. The prosecution emphasized that Tom had gone to the scene with the intent to intimidate or injure Aaron, carrying a loaded gun and cutting telephone wires to ensure that his victim could not call for help. This level of planning made the crime a premeditated act of murder, even if the fatal shooting was completely unintentional. The defense attempted to argue that the shooting was accidental and that Tom did not intend to kill Aaron. However, forensic analysis of the bullet used, designed to maximize damage, contradicted this claim. In addition, the subsequent attack on Justin, who was injured after speaking with authorities, demonstrated that Tom was willing to use extreme violence to protect himself and cover up his involvement in the crime. The jury deliberated for 2 days before finding Tom guilty of first-degree murder for Aaron's death and aggravated assault for the attack on Justin. During the sentencing phase, the prosecution emphasized the calculating nature of the crime, noting how Tom had used his technical knowledge to manipulate the crime scene to ensure that Aaron could not escape or call for help. It also highlighted the emotional and psychological impact the crime had had on those close to Aaron, including Bianca, whose initial manipulation contributed to the cycle of violence. Finally, the judge issued the following sentence. Tom was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole for the first-degree murder of Aaron. He also received an additional 10-year sentence for the attack on Justin, which would run consecutively to the first. The judge emphasized that, although Tom had not acted alone, highlighting Bianca's role in the previous manipulation, his decision to bring a gun to the confrontation and his use of extreme violence made him fully responsible for the consequences of his actions. He also noted that the case was a clear example of how obsessive jealousy and lack of emotional control can lead to devastating decisions, leaving permanent scars on the lives of all involved. For Detective Ethan Graves, the verdict brought some sense of closure, although he knew that the repercussions of the case would continue to affect those who had been close to Aaron. Bianca, though not criminally prosecuted, was marked as a central figure in the events leading up to the tragedy, and her manipulative behavior was documented as a key factor in the chain of violence that ended in murder. This case served as a grim reminder of how runaway emotions and hate-driven actions can have irreversible consequences, not only for the victims, but also for those who perpetrate them. Case 5. Damon Powell's lifeless body was discovered on the loading dock of the casino's shopping arcade, a place that was normally bustling with activity, but now seemed shrouded in an ominous atmosphere. Damon lay on the cold floor dressed in expensive new clothes, an impeccably pressed dark suit, an immaculate white shirt and shiny shoes. However, something didn't fit. He had no money or identification on him, except for a small gold key hanging from his belt, later identified as the key to a room at the Palermo Hotel. At first glance, the marks visible on his body told a story of desperate struggle. Damon had deep bruises on his neck, as if someone had held him tightly, and his knuckles were bruised, a sign that he had tried to fight back before he died. Detective Ethan Graves noted that these injuries suggested an intense physical confrontation, probably with someone who knew his victim's weaknesses well. One of the most intriguing findings was the talcum powder, typical of pool tables, that covered both Damon's clothing and the floor of the loading dock and the hallway leading to the casino. This detail caught the attention of the investigative team, as it indicated that Damon had been in recent contact with a pool table or someone who worked near one. Was it possible that the altercation had started in a gaming room? The talc appeared to be a key clue to piecing together Damon's final moments. Another crucial detail was the stains on the floor, which allowed investigators to track Damon's movements prior to his death. The footprints suggested that he had walked from the casino toward the loading dock, possibly running away from someone or something. His path was irregular, as if he had been staggering or being chased. Near the scene, investigators found an abandoned black Corvette with traces of red paint on the rear bumper. This suggested that Damon may have been involved in a previous vehicle-to-vehicle altercation, perhaps an argument that escalated quickly. The red paint appeared to match another vehicle, although the car involved had not yet been identified. A closer examination of Damon's clothing revealed something surprising. All of his clothes were new, purchased specifically for that night. A tag still attached to his pants confirmed that he had made this investment recently. This raised immediate questions. Why had Damon decided to dress so formally for the occasion? Was he trying to impress someone or prepare for an important event? Detective Graves knew that each clue, the talcum powder, the stains on the floor, the abandoned Corvette, and the new clothes, was part of a larger puzzle. Something had gone terribly wrong that night, and Damon Powell had paid the ultimate price. Now, the challenge was to piece together the events leading up to his murder and discover who was behind this seemingly premeditated crime. As Detective Ethan Graves delved deeper into the life of Damon Powell, a clearer picture began to emerge of who the victim was and how he had come to find himself on that fateful night at the loading dock. Damon was not just an ordinary man. His life was full of contrasts, ambitions, and decisions that led him to move in both legitimate and dangerous circles. Damon worked as a personal assistant to Mick Sheridan, an action movie producer famous for his flamboyant style and considerable fortune. His role was not merely administrative. Damon had proved invaluable to Mick by helping him save millions in a complicated divorce settlement. As a reward for his loyalty and skills, Mick had gifted him a Las Vegas vacation, a corporate credit card, and a few $100s in cash. For Damon, this reward represented a unique opportunity to live, if only for one night, the fantasy of wealth and glamour he had always admired from afar. Damon was a man of specific tastes and intense passions. He was a NASCAR fanatic and enjoyed fast cars, although he drove a modest Toyota in his daily life. He held an amateur racetrack license, which suggested that his love of cars was not just superficial. He had invested time and effort in learning to drive sports cars. In addition, as a child, he had developed a remarkable ability to play billiards, a talent he probably cultivated in bars and saloons during his youth. These seemingly harmless interests appear to have played a crucial role in the events that led to his death. However, the investigation also revealed a darker side of Damon. During the autopsy, traces of methamphetamine, sildenafil, and oxycodone were detected in his system. This suggested that Damon had not only been enjoying a night of excess, but that he may also have been involved in activities related to illegal substances. Detective Graves knew that this detail further complicated the case. Was it possible that Damon had fallen into a drug-related trap, or that someone had used him as a middleman in some shady deal? Damon's last night seemed like something out of a carefully constructed fantasy. According to the records and testimonies collected, he had won several games of pool at a local casino, impressing those watching him with his prowess at the table. Later, he drove a black Corvette, presumably borrowed or stolen, feeling invincible as he sped through the streets of Las Vegas. He also went on a romantic date with a blonde woman, whose identity was still unknown, and decided to celebrate by shopping for new clothes at a high-end department store. For Damon, that night must have been the pinnacle of his dreams. Success, speed, romance, and luxury. But this apparent luck ended in tragedy. Talcum powder found on his clothes, and at the crime scene confirmed that he had been playing pool before he died, possibly in the same casino where Mick Sheridan used to frequent. Stains on the floor indicated that he had tried to escape, perhaps after realizing that something was terribly wrong. The abandoned Corvette near the scene, with traces of red paint on the rear bumper, suggested that he had been involved in a previous vehicle-to-vehicle altercation, perhaps with someone following or confronting him. Detective Graves knew that Damon Powell was not simply an innocent victim. His life was full of contradictions, a loyal and efficient man at work, but also someone who flirted with unnecessary risks. His last night, full of momentary triumphs and reckless decisions, led him straight into a death trap. Now the challenge was to discover who had taken advantage of that perfect fantasy to turn it into an irreversible nightmare. Each clue, the talcum powder, the Corvette, the new clothes, and the drugs, was part of a larger story, one that reflected both Damon's aspirations and the dark forces surrounding him. One of the key pieces in reconstructing Damon Powell's last moments was the testimony of Heidi Wolf, the blonde woman who accompanied him during his last night. Heidi was an actress hired by Caprice Unlimited, a company specializing in staging customized fantasies for wealthy or aspirational clients. According to her statement, her role had been to seduce Damon as part of a carefully planned script designed to make him feel like the protagonist of a romantic and exciting story. Heidi explained that the night started out seemingly normally. At the casino, while pretending to be captivated by Damon, they both witnessed an unexpected moment: the arrival of her boyfriend, a man with whom she was supposedly in a complicated relationship. Following the script, Heidi pretended to cry inconsolably in front of Damon, who quickly comforted her. She confessed to him that her boyfriend was abusive and unfaithful, which generated empathy in Damon and reinforced the connection between them. This detail seemed to be part of the plan to completely win Damon's trust and keep him immersed in the fantasy. However, something changed drastically later. Heidi claimed that while playing pool, Damon won a big game and took $10,000 from another player. This event was not included in the script and marked a turning point in the night. According to Heidi, after this episode, the two consumed drugs together: methamphetamine, sildenafil, and oxycodone, substances that matched those found in Damon's system during the autopsy. These drugs probably intensified the chaotic atmosphere of the evening, clouding Damon's judgment and leading him to make unwise decisions. Heidi also revealed that after a night of passion in the hotel room, she left Damon alone. Before leaving, he told her that he was going out briefly but would be back soon. According to her, she never saw him alive again. This testimony was consistent with the Palermo hotel room key found in Damon's possession, as well as evidence suggesting that he had been on the move after leaving the hotel. Detective Ethan Graves noticed certain inconsistencies in Heidi's account. Although she claimed that her involvement ended when she left Damon in the room, her link to Caprice Unlimited raised important questions. Who had hired her services? Was it possible that someone close to Damon, perhaps even Mick Sheridan, had arranged this fantasy to distract or manipulate him? Furthermore, the fact that Damon had won a significant amount of money at the casino and then was chased to the loading dock suggested that the situation escalated beyond a simple theatrical performance. For the detective, Heidi was an ambiguous figure in the case. On the one hand, her testimony provided valuable details about the events leading up to the murder. On the other, her connection to a company that staged customized fantasies made her version of events difficult to fully verify. It was clear that Heidi had been an integral part of the fantasy that Damon experienced that night, but it was also possible that she was involved in something darker, intentionally or unintentionally. The name Mick Sheridan, action movie producer and Damon Powell's boss, began to emerge as a central figure in the investigation. Known for his flamboyant style and ability to move in both legitimate and shady circles, Mick had a reputation that did not go unnoticed. According to previous records, he had attempted to silence troublesome employees in the past, especially when they were involved in illicit activities or threatened to expose uncomfortable secrets. This raised a troubling question. Had he seen Damon as a threat? Damon had proven to be an invaluable personal assistant to Mick, helping him save millions in a messy divorce settlement. However, it was also likely that he was all too familiar with his boss's illicit activities, whether related to drugs, finance, or shady business dealings in the movie business. If Damon had started asking uncomfortable questions or acting recklessly, he could have become a liability for Mick. What caught Detective Ethan Graves' attention was the fact that Mick had financed Damon's fantasy through Caprice Unlimited, the company that arranged Damon's dream night with Heidi Wolf. At first glance, this seemed like a generous gesture, a reward for his loyalty and exceptional work. However, when one considered Mick's track record of eliminating problems before they became threats, a more sinister possibility arose. What if this fantasy was not just a gift, but a way to control or even eliminate Damon? Mick claimed to be in Los Angeles during the time of the murder, and his statements were initially supported by his public schedule and close witnesses. However, his indirect connection to the events of that night through Caprice Unlimited left room for suspicion. It was possible that Mick had orchestrated the fantasy as an elaborate distraction, knowing that Damon was in a vulnerable state due to his drug use and ambition to live a glamorous life. If something went wrong, Mick could steer clear of any direct involvement, leaving it to others to execute the plan. Detective Graves noticed that Damon's death coincided with a disturbing pattern in Mick's behavior. In the past, employees who had become troublemakers had been effectively silenced, either through threats, bribes, or in extreme cases, physical elimination. Damon, who had won a significant amount of money at the casino and presumably consumed drugs provided during the evening, may have been the victim of a situation that escalated out of control. Perhaps someone close to Mick, hired to keep an eye on Damon, decided to act when he felt things were getting out of control. Although Mick Sheridan was not physically present in Las Vegas during the murder, his shadow seemed to be cast over the entire scene. Funding Damon's fantasy through Caprice Unlimited could have been a strategic move to manipulate him without leaving obvious traces. If something went wrong that night, Mick would have a perfect alibi, while others could bear the consequences. To Detective Graves, Mick was a key piece of the puzzle, although his direct involvement was still unclear. His background, combined with his decision to finance such an elaborate evening for Damon, suggested that this fantasy might have been more than just a gift. Perhaps, as with many of the films he produced, Mick had written a much darker script than Damon could ever have imagined. Another name that came up during the investigation was Randy Bolin, a retired professional stunt driver with a troubled past marked by a criminal record. Randy had rented a red Ferrari that night, presumably to enjoy the lights and glamour of Las Vegas. However, what began as an exciting evening soon turned into a public humiliation when he lost $10,000 playing pool against Damon Powell. Detective Ethan Graves knew that losing such a significant amount of money could be a hard blow to anyone. But for someone like Randy, whose ego was closely tied to his reputation as a former stunt driver, this defeat was probably devastating. Randy admitted during cross-examination that he had felt a mixture of anger and helplessness after losing to Damon, a man who, he said, didn't even seem to know what he was doing. This perceived injustice may have exacerbated his reaction, leading him to act impulsively. Randy confessed that after the pool game, he decided to chase Damon in his red Ferrari. According to his testimony, he was furious and wanted to confront him, maybe to get his money back or simply to get even for the humiliation. During the chase, Randy claimed that he tried to intimidate Damon, speeding up his vehicle and following him through the streets. However, he stated that he gave up when he saw that Damon managed to escape, getting lost in the traffic and shadows of the city. Although Randy denied any direct involvement in the murder, Detective Graves could not ignore the connection between his behavior and some of the evidence found at the crime scene. Traces of red paint on the rear bumper of the black Corvette, abandoned near the loading dock, matched the color of Randy's Ferrari. This suggested that the two vehicles had been involved in a previous altercation, possibly during the chase. In addition, stains on the ground tracking Damon's movements indicated that he had been running from something or someone before arriving at the loading dock. The detective also considered Randy's history, which included a history of violent and aggressive behavior. Although Randy claimed to have given up the chase, his volatile temperament and wounded pride raised doubts about his version of events. It was possible that, in a fit of rage, Randy had followed Damon further than he admitted, confronting him on the loading dock. The bruises on Damon's neck and his bruised knuckles could be evidence of a physical struggle, perhaps with someone like Randy, who had both motive and opportunity. However, there was no conclusive evidence directly linking Randy to the murder. Although his involvement in the previous events was undeniable, his testimony and lack of direct physical evidence left him in an ambiguous position. To Detective Graves, Randy was an important piece of the puzzle, but not necessarily the final culprit. The investigation now revolved around determining whether Randy had been just a supporting actor in a chaotic night, or whether his bruised ego had led him to cross a dangerous line. His pursuit of Damon, combined with the traces of red paint and stains on the floor, suggested that he had been more involved than he was willing to admit. But had he acted alone, or was he part of a more elaborate plan orchestrated by someone else? Mick Sheridan's shadow remained a disturbing factor in the background of the case. Another key figure that emerged during the investigation was Dorian Kim, a well-known compulsive gambler in the city and Heidi Wolf's boyfriend. Dorian was a man accustomed to moving in the exclusive circles of the Palermo casino, where he used to play alone at the baccarat tables, surrounded by his bodyguards. His reputation as an inveterate gambler and his unpredictable character made him a dangerous character for those who dared to cross his path. According to the testimonies gathered, Damon Powell abruptly interrupted Dorian's game that night, accusing him of being an abusive boyfriend and compulsive gambler. This confrontation occurred just after Heidi pretended to cry in front of Damon, following the script planned by Caprice Unlimited. However, what was meant to be a controlled performance quickly escalated into a public confrontation when Damon decided to confront Dorian directly at the baccarat table. For someone like Dorian, who valued his image and status at the casino, this public accusation was a serious offense that could have deeply wounded his pride. Witnesses confirmed that following the confrontation, Dorian's bodyguards were seen chasing Damon out of the casino. Although it initially appeared to be simple intimidation, this chase coincided with stains on the ground that tracked Damon's movements before reaching the loading dock. It was possible that Dorian, offended and furious, had ordered his men to follow Damon to teach him a lesson or even eliminate him, if he felt he posed a threat to his reputation or relationship with Heidi. Detective Ethan Graves noted that this altercation fit perfectly with the pattern of events leading up to Damon's death. The bruises on Damon's neck and his bruised knuckles suggested that he had struggled against someone physically strong, possibly one of Dorian's bodyguards. In addition, the fact that Damon had tried to escape toward the loading dock indicated that he was being pursued by someone determined to catch up with him. Although Dorian denied any direct involvement in the murder, his behavior that night raised serious questions. The bodyguards accompanying him had no clear alibi, and his history as a compulsive gambler and Heidi's troubled partner made him suspect. It was possible that Dorian had seen Damon as a threat not only to his reputation, but also to his relationship with Heidi, especially if he believed she was becoming emotionally involved with him beyond the planned script. Solving the case. Dorian Kim's bodyguards. Although none of the suspects directly confessed to the murder, forensic evidence and surveillance footage led Detective Ethan Graves to conclude that Dorian Kim's bodyguards were responsible for Damon Powell's death. Each piece of the puzzle fit perfectly, revealing how a night of fantasy and excess ended in tragedy. During the interrogation, it was discovered that the knuckles of one of the bodyguards contained traces of white paint, matching the transfer found on Damon's neck. This confirmed that they had been physically involved in the fight that led to his death. Footage showed the bodyguards dragging Damon down the service corridor to the loading dock. At a critical moment, one of them kicked Damon in the neck during the confrontation, causing his asphyxiation and eventual death. This violent act was the result of a rapid escalation following Damon's public humiliation of Dorian at the baccarat table. Talcum powder found on Damon's jacket confirmed that he had been playing pool prior to the murder, reinforcing the sequence of events that began with his confrontation with Randy Bolin and culminated in the fatal altercation with the bodyguards. The red paint transferred to the black Corvette linked Randy Bolin to the initial incident, but also showed that this event was not directly related to the murder. Although Randy pursued Damon after losing $10,000, he desisted before the situation escalated to lethal violence. Additional surveillance footage. This showed Damon being chased by the bodyguards to the loading dock, where he was eventually attacked. The footage captured how he tried to escape, but was overtaken and brutally assaulted. The motive: to protect Dorian Kim's reputation. Although the murder occurred outside of Caprice Unlimited's planned script, the motive behind the crime was clear. The bodyguards acted to protect Dorian Kim's reputation. When Damon publicly confronted Dorian at the baccarat table, accusing him of being an abusive boyfriend and compulsive gambler, he struck a nerve. For someone like Dorian, who deeply valued his image and status at the casino, this public humiliation was intolerable. The bodyguards, following implicit orders or simply acting to defend their boss, decided to teach Damon a lesson. However, the situation quickly escalated into a deadly fight when one of them kicked Damon in the neck, causing him to choke. Although it was unclear whether this action was intentional or an impulsive act, the result was devastating. Case 6. A woman's body was discovered on a lonely country road near a river meandering on the outskirts of the city. The normally quiet and little-traveled spot became the epicenter of a criminal investigation when a group of hikers reported the grisly find. The victim lay naked, partially covered with branches and dry leaves, as if someone had hastily tried to hide her body. At first glance, it was clear that this was not a simple accident or suicide. It was a carefully planned, though not fully executed, murder. Detective Ethan Graves arrived on the scene shortly after the initial report. With his characteristic meticulousness, he began examining the scene, recording every detail that might lead him to the perpetrator. The first thing that caught his attention were the defensive wounds on the victim's arms and hands. These deep marks suggested that he had struggled desperately against his assailant before dying. A deep cut to the neck seemed to be the most likely cause of death, a violent and deliberate act indicating that the killer not only wanted to kill, but to ensure that his victim would not be able to resist for long. Graves bent down to inspect the ground, where drag marks were evident, tracing a path from the dirt road to where the body had been dumped. He quickly concluded that the victim had not been killed there, but that her body had been moved from another location. These marks indicated that the killer had moved the body after the crime, probably in an attempt to dispose of it in a remote location. However, the evidence left behind suggested that he had acted in haste or nervousness, which could be an asset to the investigation. Near the body, cloth fibers attached to the branches caught his attention. These fibers indicated that the victim had been transported wrapped in some kind of blanket or cloth, possibly to avoid leaving traces of blood during transport. This detail suggested that the killer had taken precautions, but not well enough to erase all clues. Among the branches near the body, Graves noticed long dark hairs, presumably belonging to the victim. However, he also found hairs of different texture and length. If these hairs did not belong to the victim, they could belong to the killer, inadvertently left behind during the struggle. A little farther away, the forensic team pointed out a fresh tire track leading from the dirt road to where the body was found. Graves walked over to examine it more closely. The track appeared fresh and matched the pattern of a medium to large vehicle, probably used to transport the body to the site. He knew this clue could lead them directly to the killer's vehicle, provided they could identify the model and compare it to suspect vehicles in the area. Finally, next to the corpse, a wristwatch with a broken dial was found. Graves carefully lifted it with tweezers, noting that it was stopped at 3:17. Although the watch seemed insignificant at first glance, its presence offered a potential connection to the victim's life. Was it hers? Was she wearing it when she was attacked? Or more disturbingly, had the killer dropped it in his haste to escape? As he walked through the scene, Graves felt the pieces slowly begin to fit together. The defensive wounds, drag marks, cloth fibers, hairs, tire track, and broken watch formed a complex but coherent puzzle. The victim had fought valiantly against his assailant, but the circumstances of his death were still shrouded in mystery. The challenge now was to reconstruct the events leading up to this brutal crime, and to discover who had committed this heinous act. The rural setting, silent and somber, seemed to hold secrets that would soon come to light. With each clue collected, the investigative team moved one step closer to the truth, while the echo of violence resounded in the cold air of the place. Following the investigation, the body was identified as Sarah Collins, a 28-year-old social worker dedicated to helping women and children in vulnerable situations. She lived alone in a small apartment and had no partner or children. She had recently mentioned to colleagues that she felt watched by someone unknown, although she never filed a formal complaint. She was last seen leaving her job at the community center the night before she disappeared. Detective Ethan Graves connected the details of her life to evidence found at the crime scene. Defensive wounds reflected her struggle against her assailant, while additional cloth fibers and hairs suggested close contact with another person. The broken watch found next to her body, stopped at 3:17, could indicate the time of her death or when she was abandoned. Her dedication to helping others may have put her in danger, leading Graves to wonder who would have wanted to silence her. One of the prime suspects in the investigation was Daniel Harper, Sarah Collins' ex-boyfriend. His relationship with Sarah had ended months before the murder, but the emotional and physical scars left by their bond were still evident. Daniel had a documented history of domestic violence, including prior allegations of verbal and physical assault during their time together. Although Sarah never pressed serious charges against him, her friends and colleagues knew that the relationship had been toxic and abusive. After the breakup, Daniel did not readily accept the end of their bond and began to show troubling signs of obsession. According to testimonies close to Sarah, Daniel repeatedly tried to contact her after the separation. He would call her late at night, send insistent messages, and sometimes show up unannounced at places she frequented, such as her apartment or the community center where she worked. This pattern of behavior suggested that Daniel was not only angry about the breakup, but also felt irrational jealousy toward anyone who might be near Sarah. For Detective Ethan Graves, this obsession immediately placed him under the magnifying glass as a possible suspect. During interrogation, Daniel claimed to be at a local bar on the night of the murder. However, his alibi proved inconsistent and unreliable. Although some witnesses confirmed seeing him there briefly, no one was able to verify his whereabouts during the entire time in question. This gap in his story left room for doubt as to whether he had been involved in the events leading up to Sarah's death. In addition, his attitude during interrogation was defensive and, at times, hostile, which increased the suspicions of the investigative team. Detective Graves noted that several elements of the case matched Daniel's profile. The defensive wounds found on Sarah's arms and hands could be the result of a physical confrontation with someone known to her, such as a violent ex-boyfriend. In addition, the feeling of being watched that Sarah had recently reported could have been related to Daniel, especially if he was obsessed with her and did not accept her independence after the separation. It was possible that her anger and jealousy had escalated to the point of crossing an irreversible line. Another troubling connection was the testimony of a neighbor of Sarah's, who mentioned seeing a suspicious vehicle hanging around her apartment in the days prior to her disappearance. Although the driver could not be identified at the time, the description of the car matched the model Daniel used to drive. This, coupled with the lack of a solid alibi, reinforced the possibility that Daniel was involved in the crime. To Detective Graves, Daniel represented a clear example of how domestic violence can escalate into even more devastating tragedies. His history of abuse, combined with his obsessive behavior and inconsistent alibi, made him a key suspect. However, conclusive forensic evidence linking him directly to the murder was lacking. In the meantime, the investigative team continued to collect information about his whereabouts and activities on the night of the crime, as well as analyzing possible connections between him and clues found at the scene, such as additional hairs or a tire track. Daniel's obsession and anger towards Sarah raised a disturbing hypothesis. Had he decided to eliminate her because he could not bear the thought of her moving on without him? Or worse, had his violence escalated to the point of committing such a brutal act without considering the consequences? For the detective, it was imperative to delve deeper into his relationship with Sarah and determine whether his rage and jealousy had led to this tragic outcome. Another suspect who came to the attention of Detective Ethan Graves was Mark Evans, a local truck driver seen driving near the crime scene on the night of the murder. Although he initially appeared to be an incidental witness, certain details in his background and behavior placed him under the investigative magnifying glass. Mark had a potential reason to feel animosity toward social workers like Sarah Collins. Years earlier, he had lost custody of his son after a social worker recommended revoking his parental rights due to concerns about his unstable lifestyle and environment. This event left a deep mark on Mark, who has since publicly expressed resentment toward the system and those who represented him. For Detective Graves, this resentment raised a disturbing hypothesis. Could Mark have directed his anger toward Sarah, seeing her as a representative of the very system that had humiliated him? During interrogation, Mark claimed to be making a late-night delivery on the night of the murder. However, he was unable to provide solid evidence of his whereabouts during the entire time in question. His work route was not properly documented, and his company records showed inconsistencies in reported schedules. This lack of clarity raised doubts as to whether he was actually busy with his work or had been involved in something more sinister. The detective noticed that several elements of the case matched Mark's circumstances. The fresh tire track found near the body could belong to a large vehicle, such as the truck Mark regularly drove. In addition, his knowledge of rural roads and his access to remote areas made him a plausible candidate to have transported the body to the location where it was abandoned. Although there was no conclusive forensic evidence directly linking Mark to the crime, his resentment toward social workers combined with his inconsistent alibi made him a relevant suspect. For Detective Graves, it was imperative to further investigate his relationship to the case, especially considering how his past might have influenced his present actions. The possibility that Mark had acted out of a desire for revenge against the system that had marginalized him added a dark layer to the case. While there was as yet no direct evidence pointing to him as the culprit, his profile suggested that he may have crossed a dangerous line, turning his resentment into violence. The investigative team continued to analyze his whereabouts and activities that night, looking for clearer connections between him and the evidence collected. Another suspect who came to the attention of Detective Ethan Graves was Mark Evans, a local truck driver seen driving near the crime scene on the night of the murder. Although he initially appeared to be an incidental witness, certain details in his background and behavior placed him under the investigative magnifying glass. Mark had a potential reason to feel animosity toward social workers like Sarah Collins. Years earlier, he had lost custody of his son after a social worker recommended revoking his parental rights due to concerns about his unstable lifestyle and environment. This event left a deep mark on Mark, who has since publicly expressed resentment toward the system and those who represented him. For Detective Graves, this resentment raised a disturbing hypothesis. Could Mark have directed his anger toward Sarah, seeing her as a representative of the very system that had humiliated him? During interrogation, Mark claimed to be making a late-night delivery on the night of the murder. However, he was unable to provide solid evidence of his whereabouts during the entire time in question. His work route was not properly documented, and his company records showed inconsistencies in reported schedules. This lack of clarity raised doubts as to whether he was actually busy with his work or had been involved in something more sinister. The detective noticed that several elements of the case matched Mark's circumstances. The fresh tire track found near the body could belong to a large vehicle, such as the truck Mark regularly drove. In addition, his knowledge of rural roads and his access to remote areas made him a plausible candidate to have transported the body to the location where it was abandoned. Although there was no conclusive forensic evidence directly linking Mark to the crime, his resentment toward social workers, combined with his inconsistent alibi, made him a relevant suspect. For Detective Graves, it was imperative to further investigate his relationship to the case, especially considering how his past might have influenced his present actions. The possibility that Mark had acted out of a desire for revenge against the system that had marginalized him added a dark layer to the case. While there was as yet no direct evidence pointing to him as the culprit, his profile suggested that he may have crossed a dangerous line, turning his resentment into violence. The investigative team continued to analyze his whereabouts and activities that night, looking for clearer connections between him and the evidence collected. Another name that came up during the investigation was Robert Klein, a neighbor of Sarah's who lived in the same building as her. Although he initially appeared to be just another resident, certain details in his background and behavior made him a relevant suspect for Detective Ethan Graves. Robert had a previous conflict with Sarah, which automatically placed him under suspicion. Months before the murder, Sarah had reported to the authorities that Robert was behaving suspiciously, mentioning that she had seen him hanging around the common areas of the building late at night, and that he seemed to be watching other residents. This report led to tensions between the two, and according to some neighbors, Robert made no secret of his resentment towards Sarah for reporting him. For Detective Graves, this personal conflict raised a troubling hypothesis. Could Robert have acted out of revenge? During the interrogation, Robert claimed to be at home watching television on the night of the murder. However, like other suspects, he was unable to provide corroborating witnesses. He lived alone and had no solid alibi, leaving room for doubt about his whereabouts during the time in question. This lack of verification increased suspicions about his possible involvement in the crime. The detective noted that several elements of the case matched Robert's circumstances. The defensive wounds on Sarah's arms suggested that she had fought someone known or close to her, such as a neighbor. In addition, the fact that Sarah had reported feeling watched recently could be related to Robert, especially if he had continued to watch her after their previous confrontation. Although there was no conclusive forensic evidence directly linking Robert to the crime, his personal conflict with Sarah, combined with his inconsistent alibi, made him a plausible suspect. For Detective Graves, it was imperative to further investigate his relationship to the case, especially considering how his resentment might have escalated into violence. The possibility that Robert had taken advantage of his proximity to Sarah to carry out the crime added a disturbing layer to the case. While there was still no direct evidence pointing to him as the culprit, his profile suggested that he may have crossed a dangerous line, turning his grudge into an irreversible act. The investigative team continued to analyze his whereabouts and activities that night, looking for clearer connections between him and the evidence collected. The case took a decisive turn when the forensic evidence began to converge directly on Mark Evans, the local truck driver whose resentment of social workers had made him a key suspect from the beginning. Finally, under the pressure of irrefutable evidence, Mark confessed to the crime. He admitted that he had been following Sarah Collins for weeks, fueled by his deep resentment toward the social workers, whom he blamed for taking custody of his son from him years earlier. His obsession with Sarah escalated to the point of committing a brutal, premeditated act. The fabric fibers found attached to the branches at the crime scene matched a blanket that Mark routinely carried in his truck. This blanket had been used to wrap Sarah's body before it was transported to the location where it was abandoned. In addition, the fresh tire track found on the rural road was an exact match to the tires on Mark's truck, confirming that his vehicle had been used to move the body. This physical evidence was decisive in linking him to the crime. Another crucial detail was the analysis of additional hairs found on branches near the body. These hairs matched DNA samples taken from the broom Mark had used to clean his truck after the murder. This fatal oversight proved that, although he tried to erase the evidence, he failed to completely remove traces of his involvement. Every clue pointed inexorably toward him, leaving him with no escape. The reconstruction of the crime revealed that Sarah was attacked by surprise while walking home after work. Mark intercepted her, probably taking advantage of his knowledge of the routes she used to take. She was stabbed in the neck with a sharp object, possibly a kitchen knife, a violent act that caused her death almost immediately. Mark then wrapped her body in the blanket he was carrying in his truck and transported it to the rural road where it was finally abandoned, trying to get rid of the evidence of his crime. Mark was arrested and formally charged with the murder of Sarah Collins. During interrogation, he admitted that his resentment toward social workers had consumed him to the point of losing control. Although he initially denied his involvement, forensic evidence led him to confess, accepting that his hatred of Sarah symbolized his resentment towards the entire system that he felt had marginalized him. For Detective Ethan Graves, this case underscored how resentment and lack of emotional resolve can lead to devastating acts of violence. Sarah Collins, a woman dedicated to helping others, lost her life at the hands of someone who could not overcome her own grief and directed it at those she held responsible for her suffering. The echo of her loss resonated deeply in her community, reminding everyone of the importance of addressing personal conflicts before they escalate into irreversible tragedies. The trial of Mark Evans was overwhelming. The prosecution presented irrefutable evidence. The fibers from the blanket, the tire track from his truck, and the hairs linked to his DNA placed him directly in the crime. In addition, they highlighted his motive: resentment towards social workers, such as Sarah Collins, whom he blamed for the loss of custody of his son. The defense tried to argue that the crime was impulsive, but the evidence showed premeditation. The use of a sharp knife and the deliberate transport of the body wrapped in a blanket disproved any idea of spontaneity. Mark admitted to following Sarah for weeks, but minimized his responsibility, claiming he didn't want to go that far. The jury found Mark guilty of first-degree murder. The judge emphasized the cruelty and planning of the crime, as well as the devastating impact on the community. Ultimately, Mark was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a punishment that reflected the severity of his actions. For Detective Ethan Graves, the verdict closed the case, though the loss of Sarah left an indelible mark. Her murder was a tragic reminder of how bitterness can lead to irreparable acts,